Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm 29 years old, and 3 weeks ago I found out that 14 years of loyalty can be erased in about 90 seconds in front of a room full of people in expensive suits without one single person lifting a hand to stop it. I want to start with the ending because that's usually where the real truth lives anyway. I was the one who kept that company standing every single day for almost a decade. I was the one who fixed the mistakes nobody else even noticed. And when it finally mattered, when it finally counted, I was the one who got walked out the front door, while the man who actually caused the disaster sat there in his chair and said absolutely nothing. I keep replaying how quiet it all was. Not one shout, not one argument in my favor, just my name, read out flatly, like an item on somebody's agenda, and then my badge being collected off a conference table like it was nothing at all. 14 years, and it took less time to end than it takes to order a coffee. Here's the part I still can't get over. I wasn't hired into that company through some fancy program or some Ivy League pedigree. I got in through the back door, through a phone call from a family friend who said the old man needed somebody reliable to answer his mail and keep his calendar straight. I never imagined that back door would lead to running half the operations of a company that did almost $60 million a year in freight and logistics. But it did, quietly, year after year, while somebody else's name sat on the door. Have you ever given everything you had to something quietly for years, and then watched somebody else take the bow for it like it was always theirs? Because that's what this story is about, and something tells me some of you already know exactly what that feeling sits like in your chest. If you're still with me, do me one favor before I keep going. Hit subscribe. It costs nothing. It's completely free, and it's honestly the only reason a small channel like this one gets to keep telling stories like mine to people who need to hear them. And if you've ever been the one who did the work while somebody else took the credit, tell me in the comments because I read every single one, and I promise you, you are not alone in this. My name is Rachel Bennett, and this is the story of how I got publicly humiliated, fired in front of investors, blamed for a disaster I didn't cause, and how I made exactly one phone call that took down every single person responsible for it before the sun came up the next day. It started 14 years ago when I was 15 and answering phones part-time for a man named Robert Whitmore, who had built a mid-size freight and logistics company from a single truck he bought used in 1983. By the time I was 22, fresh out of a community college accounting program, he brought me on full-time, officially as his executive assistant, unofficially as the only person in that building who actually understood how every piece of the operation fit together. Warehouses in 3 states, contracts with retailers you'd recognize immediately, a workforce of nearly 400 people. And somehow, within 4 years, I was the one who understood all of it better than anybody with a title above mine. Robert used to say I had the map in my head. He meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. He'd call me into his office at 6 in the morning before anyone else arrived, spread invoices and route sheets across his desk, and ask me what I thought before he asked anybody else, including his own son. I didn't understand back then how much that would matter later. I just thought it meant I was good at my job. I didn't realize it meant he trusted me with something nobody else knew existed. I want to pause here because I think this next part is the piece that broke something in me long before the firing ever happened. Robert had a son named Gary, and Gary had a son named David. 2 generations of Whitmore men who inherited a company they never had to fight for, and neither of them, not once in 14 years, ever learned it the way I learned it. David, especially, grew up assuming that a company with his last name on the building was simply owed to him, the way some people assume the tide will come in. For 9 straight years, I watched David Whitmore walk into meetings wearing my analysis like a suit he'd picked out himself. I would spend a weekend rebuilding a shipping route that was bleeding the company $40,000 a month, hand the deck to him on a Sunday night so he could review it, and then sit in the back of a Monday meeting and listen to him present every single slide as though the numbers had occurred to him in the shower. Nobody ever asked who actually built it. Nobody ever thought to ask. He had the last name. I had the folder. It happened so gradually that for years I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself the company was running better because of what I did. And that should be enough that the credit was a small price to pay for actually being useful, actually being needed. I used to say that to myself in the mirror some mornings, like a little prayer. It should be enough. It should be enough. I was 31 years old before I admitted to myself how much it wasn't. There was a specific moment about 6 years ago that I think about more than almost any other. We landed a 3-year distribution contract with a regional grocery chain, 42 stores. A deal that took me 5 months of late nights to structure so the margins actually worked. At the signing dinner, Gary stood up, raised a glass and said, "None of this would exist without David's vision." David sat 2 seats down from me, smiling, sipping his wine, while I sat there in a dress I'd bought specifically for that dinner, clapping along with everyone else, because what else was there to do? Nobody in that room knew my name. The waitstaff knew my name. Nobody at that table did. I started keeping a private folder on my laptop after that, not to prove anything to anyone, just for myself, just so I would have some kind of record that the version of events in my head was real and not something I'd exaggerated in my own bitterness. Every project, every late night, every model I built, every crisis I quietly absorbed, so it never reached Robert's desk as a problem, only ever as a solution that was already handled. I called the folder Proof, which in hindsight feels almost embarrassingly literal, but I think some part of me already knew I might need it someday. There was another night about 4 years ago that I still think about more than I probably should. We were closing out the fiscal year, and David had promised the board a set of final numbers by 5 o'clock on a Friday, numbers he had never actually built himself. Numbers that existed only because I had spent the previous 2 weekends reconciling almost a decade of inconsistent warehouse reporting into something that finally made sense. He came by my office at 4:45 that Friday, dropped a blank template on my desk and said, "Can you just fill this in real quick? I've got a thing." I stayed until nearly 11 that night finishing it. He left the building at 5:15, and the following Monday, an email went out from Gary praising David's diligence in closing out a difficult fiscal year. I read that email standing at my kitchen counter, in the clothes I'd slept in, and I didn't say a single word about it to anyone. I want to explain something about why I never said anything, because I think people watching this might wonder why I let it go on for so long. It wasn't cowardice, or at least it didn't feel like cowardice from the inside. It felt like math. If I complained, I risked being labeled difficult, ungrateful, or worse, replaceable, and I had watched 2 other women in that building get quietly pushed out over the years for far smaller complaints than the one I was carrying. So I did the calculation the way I did every other calculation in that job, carefully, and I decided again and again that staying quiet and staying necessary was safer than being right and being unemployed. The thing about being invisible at work is that it doesn't stay at work. It follows you home. It sits with you at dinner. I remember being at my sister's birthday party, and somebody asked what I did for a living, and I said, "I help run operations for a logistics company." And my own mother corrected me gently without meaning any harm at all and said, "She helps out with the paperwork for the Whitmores." That's the sentence that actually broke something in me, not a boardroom slight. My own mother, at a birthday party, shrinking 14 years of my life down into helps out with the paperwork. The one person who never made me feel that way was Megan, a friend from the accounting department who'd started at the company almost the same year I did. Megan was the only other person in that building who actually understood the shape of what I did all day, because she was the one who processed half the invoices behind my decisions without ever getting to sign off on any of them either. We used to eat lunch together in the break room, away from the executive floor, and she was the one who first said out loud plainly over a sandwich, "You know you basically run this place, right? Like, actually run it." I remember laughing it off the first time she said it. By the 3rd or 4th time, I stopped laughing because some part of me had started to believe it might be true. Megan was also the one who, more than once, gently suggested I start looking elsewhere, somewhere my name might actually end up on the door of an office instead of just on the folder of work nobody credited to me. I always told her I couldn't, not yet, that Robert needed me, and later that the company needed me, as if my own needs were a variable that simply didn't belong in that particular equation. Looking back now, I think Megan saw the shape of what was coming years before I let myself see it. I want to be honest about something here because I think it's important. I am not by nature somebody who explodes. I don't slam doors, I don't raise my voice in meetings. I was raised to believe that being calm and being competent were the same thing as being valued, and it took me a very long time and one very specific betrayal to learn that those are actually three completely different things, and only one of them was ever guaranteed to me. If any part of this is sounding familiar to you right now, if you've ever sat in a room and watched somebody take credit for your work while you smiled and said nothing, I want you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. It's free, it takes about 2 seconds, and it's genuinely the reason this story is able to reach anyone at all tonight. Stories like mine don't get told in boardrooms. They only get told here. Robert passed away 3 years ago in the spring from a heart condition he'd been quietly managing for longer than any of us realized. I was the one who found out first, actually, before Gary did, because Robert had called me to his house that last week, sat me down at his kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee neither of us drank, and told me he was proud of what I'd built inside a company that would never officially say my name on an org chart. I remember thinking it was a strange thing to say. I understand now that it was a warning, dressed up as a compliment, about exactly what was coming. After he died, everything shifted, but not in the direction I expected. I assumed foolishly that his absence might finally create some space for recognition, that with the old man gone, somebody might finally look at the actual structure of the company and notice who was holding it together. Instead, Gary simply slid into the chairman role Robert had vacated, and David was promoted to vice president of operations, a title that, on paper, made him my superior, despite the fact that I had been running operations in practice for the better part of a decade before he'd finished his business degree. I remember the day they announced David's promotion in an all-staff email. I read it standing at the warehouse floor manager's desk, coffee in hand, and I laughed, actually laughed out loud, a short, involuntary sound that startled the floor manager standing next to me. He looked at me and said quietly, "You know that should have been you, right?" I didn't answer him. I just folded the printed email in half and went back to my office and finished the report David needed for his first executive meeting as my new boss. There was one more thing Robert told me that last week at his kitchen table, something I filed away and mostly forgot about, because grief has a way of making even important sentences blur into background noise. He told me that he'd put some old papers in order with his attorney, a man named James Callahan, who had handled Robert's personal and family legal matters for almost 30 years. Robert said, almost offhandedly, stirring sugar into coffee he never drank, that if anything ever felt unfair to me at that company, truly unfair, I should call James before I did anything else. I nodded, thanked him, and thought it was just an old man's way of saying he cared about me. I had no idea what those papers actually were. For the next 3 years, under David's official title and my unofficial reality, the pattern from before didn't just continue, it accelerated. David made decisions in meetings I hadn't been invited to, decisions built entirely on numbers I had prepared for someone else's use. And when those decisions went sideways, which they often did, it fell to me, quietly, after hours, to repair the damage before it ever reached a client's desk or a board report. I became, without ever asking for the job, David Whitmore's insurance policy. Nobody thanked an insurance policy. You just expect it to be there when the house is on fire. About a year and a half ago, I actually came close to leaving. A competitor logistics firm out in Columbus reached out to me directly through a recruiter who had somehow gotten my name from an industry conference I hadn't even meant to be memorable at. They offered me a director of operations title, an actual title with my actual name on it, along with a salary increase that would have meant something real for the first time in years. I sat with that offer letter open on my laptop for 4 straight nights, reading it over and over, feeling something close to hope for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. Gary must have sensed something because right around that same time, he asked me to lunch, just the 2 of us, at a steakhouse downtown he usually reserved for clients. Over the meal, he told me, in that warm, confiding voice he was so good at using, that he'd been talking to the board about formalizing my role, that a director title was basically already decided, and that he just needed a little more time to work it through with David given the family dynamics involved. I remember driving home that night feeling something loosen in my chest for the first time in years. I called the recruiter the next morning and turned the Columbus offer down. 4 months passed, then 6. The promotion Gary had described so warmly at that steakhouse never once appeared on an agenda, never once got mentioned again, not by him, not by anyone. When I finally asked him about it directly, he told me almost apologetically that David had felt uncomfortable with the optics of me holding a title that might read as equal to his, and that they'd decided to revisit it after the cold storage expansion settled down. I said I understood. I did not understand. I went home that night and sat in my car in my own driveway for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside, because I finally fully understood that the promotion had never really been about timing at all. It had been about keeping me exactly where I was, useful and quiet, for as long as that arrangement kept working for everyone except me. By early this year, the company had grown into something Robert himself might not have recognized. We'd expanded into 2 new states, signed a major partnership with a national retail chain, and were preparing to bring in a group of outside investors to fund a further expansion into cold storage logistics, a market David had been publicly loudly enthusiastic about for over a year, despite understanding almost nothing about its actual operational complexity. I understood it. I'd spent 4 months building the entire feasibility model myself in the evenings after my regular work was done because David asked me to just put something together and never once asked how. The investor meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in March in the top floor conference room of Whitmore Tower downtown, the room with the wall of glass overlooking the Cuyahoga River and the kind of leather chairs that cost more than some people's cars. I remember standing at that window at 6:30 that morning before anyone else arrived, coffee in hand, looking down at the frozen river and feeling something in my stomach that I can only describe now as a warning I didn't listen to closely enough. The 2 months leading up to that meeting had taken more out of me than almost any stretch of work I'd ever put in, and I had put in plenty over 14 years. I was canceling weekend plans without telling anyone why. I missed my own cousin's engagement dinner because a vendor contract needed rebuilding overnight. I started waking up at 4 in the morning with my mind already running numbers before my feet even hit the floor. And some mornings I'd lie there in the dark doing mental math on freight margins until my alarm finally went off, as if my body had simply stopped believing that rest was something it was allowed to have. Megan noticed before I said anything to her, the way she always did. She caught me in the break room one afternoon, maybe 3 weeks before the investor meeting, and just looked at me for a long moment before saying, "Rachel, you look like you're running on fumes and spite." I laughed because it was true, and because laughing was easier than admitting how frightened I actually was underneath the exhaustion. Frightened that if this expansion failed, somehow it would still land on me, the way everything always eventually did. The night before the meeting itself, after I'd finally gotten off the phone with the Larkfield contact and understood exactly how bad the damage was, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time before I even opened my laptop to start rebuilding the model. I remember looking at my own hands under the kitchen light, thinking about how many nights over 14 years those same hands had quietly fixed somebody else's mistake, so it never had to become anyone's problem but mine. I remember thinking, with a kind of tired clarity, that I was tired of being the reason nothing ever visibly broke. I want to stop here for a second because I think this is the point in the story where a lot of people would tell me to just skip ahead to what happened. But I think the build-up matters. I think you need to understand exactly how much I had already swallowed, exactly how many small humiliations I had already absorbed and called professionalism, before you understand what it actually took for me to reach my breaking point, and what it took for me to remember what Robert had told me at that kitchen table. If you've made it this far with me, I want to ask you something honestly. Has there ever been a version of you that kept absorbing damage for other people, quietly, for years, telling yourself it was fine, telling yourself it was just part of the job, until one single day made all of it impossible to keep swallowing anymore? Type it in the comments if you have. I read everyone, and honestly, writing this out has been its own kind of therapy for me too. The feasibility model I built for the cold storage expansion had one clearly marked, clearly flagged assumption sitting right at the top of the document. A note I had written myself in bold red text 3 separate times across 3 separate drafts. The projected numbers only worked if we secured a specific regional distribution partner, a company called Larkfield Freight, under a fixed-rate contract locked in before construction began on the new facility. Without that locked rate, the entire cold storage division would operate at a loss for at least its first 18 months, a number large enough to spook any investor in that room within about 30 seconds of hearing it. David had been handling the Larkfield negotiation personally, for reasons I still don't fully understand, except that he wanted, for once, to own something end to end without my fingerprints on it, without needing to ask me how. I had sent him 4 separate emails over 6 weeks, each one gently, professionally, insistently reminding him that the entire investor pitch hinged on that contract being finalized and locked before Thursday's meeting. I have those emails still. I've read them more times than I'd like to admit since everything happened. 2 days before the investor meeting, I asked David directly in the hallway outside his office whether Larkfield had signed. He looked at me, that particular look he'd perfected over the years, somewhere between irritation and boredom, and said, "It's handled, Rachel. Relax." I remember the exact hallway. I remember the exact tile pattern on the floor. I remember thinking even then, with some part of my brain that had learned this lesson too many times already, that it's handled from David. Whitmore had never once in 9 years actually meant it was handled. It wasn't handled. Larkfield's negotiating team, frustrated by weeks of David's unreturned calls and shifting terms, had quietly walked away from the deal 4 days earlier and signed an exclusive regional contract with one of our direct competitors instead. Nobody told David this had happened, because nobody at Larkfield had any particular reason to notify a vice president who had stopped returning their calls in the first place. I only found out myself the night before the meeting, at 9:30 at night, from a source at Larkfield who happened to still have my number from an earlier stage of the negotiation, back when I was the one actually running it before David decided he wanted the win to himself. I called David immediately. He didn't pick up. I texted him 3 times, each message more urgent than the last, telling him the entire cold storage projection was now built on a partner who no longer existed, that we needed to either postpone the investor presentation or completely rebuild the financial model overnight around a fallback partner with significantly worse rates. I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning that night, rebuilding as much of the model as I could on my own, without his input, without his knowledge, trying to save a presentation I hadn't been the one to break. By the time I got to the office at 6 the next morning, exhausted, running on 90 minutes of sleep and a coffee that had gone cold in my car, David still hadn't responded to a single message. I found out later he'd turned his phone off the night before to get proper rest before the big presentation. I sat in the conference room 40 minutes before anyone else arrived, staring at a partially rebuilt financial model I knew still had gaps in it. Gaps I hadn't had time to fully close. And I felt something in my chest that I can only describe now as dread with a deadline attached to it. If any of you have ever stayed up all night trying to fix a disaster somebody else caused, just so it wouldn't blow up in both of your faces the next morning, I want you to know I see you, and I want to ask you again to subscribe if this story is landing anywhere close to home for you. It's free. It helps this channel keep finding people who need to hear these stories, and it means more to me than you probably realize that you're even still here listening. The investors arrived at 9 sharp. 4 of them from a private equity group out of Chicago that specialized in logistics and distribution roll-ups, along with 2 of our own board members and Gary himself, seated at the head of the table in the chair that used to be his father's. David presented the opening slides with his usual polished confidence, the kind of confidence that had never once in my experience been built on actually knowing the material underneath it. I sat 2 seats down, the way I always did, close enough to be useful, far enough to be invisible. It happened around the 11-minute mark of the presentation. One of the Chicago investors, a sharp, quiet woman named Diane something, I never did learn her last name, asked a very simple, very direct question. Can you confirm Larkfield has signed the distribution agreement referenced on slide 14? The room went still in a way that rooms only go still when everyone already senses what's coming before it actually arrives. David said yes. He said it confidently, cleanly, without a flicker of hesitation, because David Whitmore had never once in his entire career needed to actually verify a fact before stating it as one. Diane nodded, satisfied, and moved to her next question, and for about 4 seconds I actually believed we might survive the meeting after all, that maybe somehow David had fixed it overnight without telling me. Then Gary, of all people, decided to be thorough. He turned to me, specifically to me, because on some level, some deep institutional level, even Gary knew that if anyone in that room actually had the paperwork, it would be me. "Rachel, can you pull up the signed agreement for the group?" he asked, gesturing toward the screen at the front of the room. And in that moment, with 4 investors and 2 board members and my boss and my boss's father all staring at me, I had exactly 2 choices. I could lie for David right there on the spot in front of people who could destroy this company's credibility with one phone call to their own board. Or I could tell the truth and let the truth land wherever it was going to land. I told the truth. I said as calmly and as professionally as I possibly could that Larkfield had not signed, that they had in fact signed with a competitor 4 days earlier, and that the projections on the slide in front of them were, as of that morning, no longer accurate. I watched the color drain out of David's face in real time. I watched Diane's pen stop moving. I watched Gary's jaw tighten in a way I had genuinely never seen before, not once in 14 years. What happened over the next 90 seconds is something I have replayed in my mind so many times I could probably recite it word for word. Gary didn't ask David a single question. He didn't ask why the deal had fallen through, or why nobody had flagged it earlier, or why his own son had just told 4 investors something demonstrably false in a room where the truth was sitting 9 feet away wearing a name tag that said Rachel Bennett. Instead, Gary turned to me and said, in a voice that carried across the entire glass conference room, "This is exactly the kind of failure I've been worried about with you handling critical vendor relationships. We're going to need to make a change. I want you to understand something. I had not touched the Larkfield negotiation in 6 weeks. I had sent 4 written warnings about exactly this risk. I had the receipts, literally, in my email, sitting untouched in a folder I could have pulled up on that very screen in about 11 seconds. And instead of asking a single question, instead of even glancing at his own son, Gary Whitmore looked directly at me in front of 4 private equity investors from Chicago and fired me on the spot, effective immediately. Security escort included, as though I were the one who had walked away from that contract negotiation instead of the man sitting silently to his right. If you're watching this and you've ever been blamed for someone else's mistake, publicly, with absolutely no chance to defend yourself, I need you to hear this part clearly. It is one of the loneliest feelings a person can experience, and I want you to know that if it's happened to you, you are not imagining how unfair it was. Please subscribe to this channel. If it hasn't happened already, it costs nothing. And honestly, knowing that people are still here listening is the only thing that's made telling this story feel worth it. A security guard named Marcus, a kind man I'd said good morning to nearly every day for 6 years, walked me down from the 14th floor in complete silence, carrying a single banker's box with the contents of my desk, my framed photo of my late grandmother, a coffee mug, a small potted plant that had somehow survived 4 office moves. Neither of us said a word in that elevator. I remember watching the floor numbers count down, 14, 13, 12, and thinking with a kind of numb clarity that this was the exact elevator I had ridden up in at 6:30 that same morning, coffee in hand, trying to save a presentation for people who would fire me for the effort. I didn't cry in the building. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the crying to happen right there, dramatically, in the lobby. It didn't. I walked out through the revolving glass doors of Whitmore Tower into a cold March morning, got into my car in the parking garage, and sat there for 11 minutes without turning the key, staring at the concrete pillar in front of me, feeling something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite rage, something closer to a kind of total bottomless quiet. I didn't call anyone from that parking garage. I thought about calling Megan, my phone actually sitting unlocked in my lap for a while, her name pulled up on the screen, but I couldn't make my thumb press call. I think some part of me needed to sit in that silence alone first, without anyone's comfort softening it, before I let a single other person witness what had just happened to me. I've thought about that 11 minutes many times since. It was the last quiet moment before everything in my life started moving again, and some instinct in me seemed to know it and wanted to hold on to the stillness for just a little longer. I drove home to my apartment in a modest neighborhood, about 20 minutes outside downtown, the kind of place with tree-lined streets and a coffee shop on the corner. Nothing like the Shaker Heights address where David lived in a house his grandfather had bought him outright at 26. I sat on my couch, still wearing my work blazer, and I didn't cry there either, not right away. I just sat in silence for a long time, replaying Gary's voice, replaying the exact words, "We're going to need to make a change," over and over, like a song stuck somewhere behind my ribs. It was around 8 that night, 3 untouched cups of tea later, when I finally allowed myself to cry, not out of sadness exactly, but out of something closer to exhaustion, the kind that comes from finally putting down a weight you've been carrying so long. You forgot it was heavy. And it was somewhere in the middle of that, sitting on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, that I remembered Robert's voice from 3 years earlier at his kitchen table, stirring sugar into coffee he never drank, telling me about old papers and a man named James Callahan. I sat up straight. I actually remember the physical sensation of it, like something clicking into place in my spine. I hadn't thought about that conversation in years. I'd filed it away as an old man's sentimental gesture, a kind way of saying he valued me before he died. But sitting there on my kitchen floor, fired, humiliated and furious in a way I had never let myself be furious before, I suddenly needed to know exactly what those papers were. If this is the part of the story where you're leaning forward a little, waiting to see what happens next, I completely understand, and I promise we're getting there. But first, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. This channel survives entirely on people like you, choosing to stick around for stories like mine, and it genuinely means everything that you've stayed with me this far into it. I found James Callahan's number the next morning in an old email thread from Robert's estate proceedings 3 years earlier, a name I'd only interacted with briefly professionally back when the will was being settled. I called him at 9:15, my hands actually shaking slightly as the phone rang, and when he answered I said simply, "Mr. Callahan, this is Rachel Bennett. Robert once told me that if anything ever felt unfair at the company, I should call you before I did anything else. I think that day is today." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I genuinely thought the call had dropped. Then, James Callahan said, in a slow, measured voice that I will remember for the rest of my life, "Rachel, I have been waiting 3 years for this phone call. Can you come to my office this afternoon?" I drove to his office that same day, a modest, old-fashioned practice above a bakery in a quiet part of town, nothing like the glass tower I'd been escorted out of less than 24 hours earlier. James Callahan was in his late 60s, silver-haired, wearing reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he greeted me with the kind of gentle, patient warmth that made me feel, for the first time in a full day, like somebody in this story actually saw me clearly. He sat me down and told me something I genuinely was not prepared for. 3 years earlier, in the final months of his life, Robert Whitmore had quietly restructured his controlling ownership in the company. Instead of leaving his voting shares directly to Gary, as everyone, including Gary, had always assumed he would, Robert had placed 41% of the company's controlling shares into an irrevocable family trust, the Whitmore Legacy Trust, with specific binding instructions about how that trust's voting power could be exercised. And then James told me the part that made the room actually tilt a little around me. Robert had named me, not Gary, not David, not any blood relative, as the sole successor trustee of that trust, with full authority to exercise its voting rights the moment I formally invoked the position. Robert had told James, in his own words, that he trusted the actual company, the one built on freight lanes and payroll and 400 employees' livelihoods, to the person who had run it faithfully for years, without ever once asking what was in it for her, rather than to the family members who had only ever asked what the company owed them. I sat there in that small office above the bakery, absolutely silent for what felt like a full minute. 41% of controlling votes was not a majority on its own, but combined with two smaller institutional shareholders who, James explained, had grown quietly frustrated with Gary's leadership over the past 2 years, it was more than enough to force an emergency vote of the full board. Robert hadn't just left me a kind gesture. He had left me a functioning, fully legal instrument of real power, sitting untouched for 3 years because I never once thought to ask if it existed. If any part of you is sitting there thinking that sounds too good to be true, I understand completely, because that's exactly what I said to James Callahan in that office. He simply opened a drawer, pulled out a sealed, notarized copy of the trust documents Robert had signed with 2 independent witnesses present, and slid it across the desk toward me. It was real, every clause of it was real, and every clause of it had been sitting quietly in a filing cabinet for 3 years, waiting for a day exactly like the one I'd just had. James told me one more thing that afternoon that I've carried with me ever since. He said Robert had come to his office alone, without Gary, without David, about 8 months before he passed, and had sat in the same chair I was sitting in, and had said, almost word for word, "My son will run the business the way he thinks a business should be run. But Rachel already knows how it actually runs. If it ever comes down to protecting the people who work there, I want her holding the keys, not him." James said Robert had cried a little saying it, embarrassed by his own emotion, and had made James promise never to tell me unless the day came that I truly needed to know. I want to say something honestly here because I think it matters. In that moment, sitting in that office, I did not feel triumphant. I felt something closer to grief, actually. Grief for the version of myself who had spent 3 additional years being underestimated and overlooked while carrying a piece of paper's worth of real power the entire time without knowing it. But underneath that grief, something else was also waking up. Something patient and very, very calm. If you've ever discovered later than you should have that you had more power in a situation than anyone let you believe. I want to hear about it in the comments, because I think that particular kind of realization changes something permanent in a person. And if this story has been worth your time so far, please make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next is the part I've genuinely been looking forward to telling you. James explained the mechanics to me clearly and carefully. As successor trustee, I could formally invoke my authority with a single sign notice to the board, triggering an emergency shareholder meeting within 72 hours under the company's own bylaws. Bylaws Robert himself had written decades earlier. At that meeting, the Trust's 41% voting bloc, combined with the 2 smaller institutional shareholders James had already quietly reached out to that same afternoon, would be more than sufficient to remove any sitting officer of the company, including a chairman, for cause. I asked James what "for cause" would actually require in this situation. He looked at me over his reading glasses and said simply, "Rachel, you have 4 written emails warning David Whitmore about the Larkfield contract dated and time-stamped that he ignored. You have a chairman who fired the one person who tried to prevent a public failure in front of investors while protecting the person who actually caused it. That is not a difficult case to make to a board that already has doubts about this leadership." We spent the rest of that afternoon in his office building the notice methodically, calmly, the way Robert himself would have built anything important, checking every citation twice. And at exactly 4:40 in the afternoon, less than 28 hours after I had been walked out of Whitmore Tower with a banker's box and a dying potted plant, I picked up my phone, and I made one single phone call to James Callahan's direct line, formally instructing him to file the notice invoking my authority as trustee, on the record, effective immediately. That was it. That was the entire call. It lasted less than 90 seconds, almost exactly as long as the meeting that had ended my career the morning before. I didn't raise my voice on that call. I didn't say anything dramatic. I simply said, "James, file it," and he said, "Consider it done," and I hung up the phone and sat there in my car in the parking lot outside his office, watching the sun start to go down over a town I had quietly kept running for 14 years, without anyone ever really knowing my name. If this is the moment in the story you've been waiting for, I understand completely, and I want to say thank you for staying with me this long to get here. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is genuinely the perfect time. Because what happened over the following 48 hours is honestly the part of the story that people tell me they think about the most. By 6 the next morning, the emergency notice had been formally served to every sitting board member and to Gary and David directly, along with a full accounting of the Larkfield failure, my 4 written warnings, and a formal notice of trust authority signed and notarized by James Callahan. I heard later from Marcus, the security guard who had walked me out just 2 days earlier, that Gary arrived at the office that morning to find 2 of the company's outside board members already waiting for him in the lobby, along with a process server. The emergency shareholder meeting was set for that Friday morning in the very same 14th floor conference room where I had been fired, the same glass wall overlooking the same frozen river. I chose to attend in person. James Callahan sat beside me, along with representatives from the 2 institutional shareholders who had aligned with the trust's position once they saw the documented timeline of what had actually happened. Gary tried briefly to challenge the validity of the trust structure, standing at the head of that same table, insisting his father would never have done this without telling him. James simply placed the notarized trust documents on the table, along with a personal letter Robert had written and sealed for exactly this moment addressed to his son, which James read aloud in that quiet, steady voice of his. I won't repeat every word of that letter here because some of it was between a father and a son, but one line has stayed with me. Robert had written, "I love you, Gary, but I built this on trust, not blood, and Rachel earned what you were only ever given." I watched the 2 institutional shareholder representatives during that reading, 2 people I'd only ever met briefly at annual meetings, and I saw something shift visibly in their expressions once the timeline was laid out clearly, the emails, the dates, the warnings ignored, the firing that followed. One of them, an older man named Stephen, who represented a pension fund with a meaningful stake in the company, leaned over to his colleague and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "This isn't even a close call." That sentence, more than almost anything else that day, told me the outcome before the vote itself even started. The vote took 11 minutes. Gary Whitmore was removed as chairman for cause, effective immediately, on the combined authority of the trust and the 2 institutional shareholders. David Whitmore was removed from his position as vice president of operations in the same session, cited specifically for the Larkfield failure and for knowingly misrepresenting the status of that contract to investors. A fact that, once documented clearly, no board member in that room felt any need to defend. 2 other executives who had actively helped bury my written warnings in David's inbox, protecting him rather than the company, were placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full internal review. I want to be honest about how that moment actually felt because it wasn't the triumphant cinematic scene you might expect. I didn't stand up and gloat. I didn't even smile. Not really. I sat there, quietly, watching 2 men who had spent years making me feel small get escorted through the exact same process I had gone through 2 days earlier, and mostly what I felt was tired and strangely sad, the way you feel sad watching something break that never had to break in the first place, if only somebody had simply told the truth a little sooner. David tried to catch my eye on his way out of that conference room. I let him. I didn't say anything cruel. I just looked at him, calmly, the way you'd look at weather that's already passed, and I said one sentence quietly, just for him to hear. "I sent you 4 emails, David." Then I turned back to James, and I let him walk out the door I had been walked out of 2 days before. If you've ever wondered what it actually feels like when the truth finally catches up to the people who buried it, I hope this gave you some honest sense of it, because it wasn't loud, and it wasn't sweet revenge in the way movies make it look. It was quiet, and it was exact, and it was, more than anything else, simply fair. If this story has meant something to you, please subscribe, and please share it with somebody you know who's still waiting for their own version of this moment. In the weeks that followed, the board, now operating under the trust's controlling influence, offered me the interim chairman position while a formal search began for permanent leadership, a search I made clear I was open to being considered for myself. On my own terms, at my own pace, without anyone assuming I'd simply take whatever they offered out of gratitude. I said yes to the interim role, but only after I sat down with James and had every term put in writing, my compensation, my authority, my exit terms, everything Robert himself would have insisted I demand, and never had, because for 14 years, nobody had ever thought to ask what I actually deserved. Gary called me twice in the month after the vote. I let both calls go to voicemail. He eventually sent a long, carefully worded letter, part apology, part explanation, part quiet request that I consider bringing him back in some advisory capacity. I wrote back 3 sentences. I told him I accepted his apology as sincere. I told him I had no intention of extending trust I hadn't been given a reason to extend. And I told him that some things, once broken clearly enough in front of enough witnesses, don't get quietly repaired just because time has passed. David never reached out at all, not once, which honestly told me more about him than anything he'd ever said in 9 years of meetings. I heard through people still at the company that he'd taken a position at a smaller firm 2 states away, a fresh start, presumably one where nobody yet knew the name Larkfield. I heard secondhand, through someone who used to work under him, that David told people at his new job a slightly softened version of what happened, something about restructuring after a family transition, which I suppose is technically true, in the way that leaving out almost everything important can still technically be true. I didn't correct the story when I heard about it. I didn't need to. The people who actually mattered, the ones who had watched it happen in that room, already knew exactly what occurred, and that was enough for me. Diane, the investor from Chicago who had asked the question that started all of it, called me personally about a month later after the dust had settled, just to say her firm was still interested in the cold storage partnership, now that the numbers and the leadership were something they could actually trust. We rebuilt that deal properly over the following few months, with a real regional partner locked in at a fair rate, and it closed by early summer, becoming, ironically, one of the strongest growth lines the company had added in years, built on the exact plan I had drafted alone, months earlier. In evenings nobody had ever thought to thank me for. Marcus, the security guard who had walked me down in silence with my banker's box, was one of the first people I asked to see once I was settled into the interim chairman role. I found him at his usual post near the lobby elevators, and I thanked him directly for the quiet decency he'd shown me on the worst morning of my professional life. A few weeks later, when a facilities supervisor position opened up, I made sure his application actually got read by someone who mattered instead of disappearing into the pile the way mine so often had. The financial terms James helped me negotiate were, for the first time in 14 years, terms that actually reflected what I was worth on paper. A base compensation nearly double what I'd been earning as an unofficial operations lead, a formal equity stake in the company separate from the trust itself, and a contract that spelled out, in plain written language, exactly what my role was and exactly what I was owed, something that had simply never existed for me before, not once, in all those years of handshake understandings and vague promises over steakhouse lunches. I called my mother about 2 weeks after the board vote and told her, plainly, without bitterness, that I was serving as chairman of the company now, that my name was going to be on the door, actually on it, printed and permanent. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said softly, "I'm sorry I ever called it helping out with the paperwork." I told her she didn't need to apologize, that she'd only ever repeated back to me the way I let the world describe what I did. It was one of the more honest conversations we've had in years. Word moved through the warehouse floor fast, the way it always does in a place like that, faster than any official memo ever could. Floor managers I'd worked alongside for a decade started stopping by my new office just to say they were glad, genuinely glad, that it had landed the way it did. One of them, the same man who'd asked me in a hallway years earlier if the promotion should have been mine, poked his head in one afternoon and said simply, "Told you," before heading back down to the floor. I laughed harder at that than I had in months. I moved my office up to the 14th floor about 6 weeks after everything happened, into the same corner space that used to be Gary's, the one with the glass wall and the view of the river. On my first morning there, I found a small, unmarked box sitting on the desk. Inside, it was Robert's old watch, the plain gold one he'd worn every single day I knew him, along with a short handwritten note from James saying Robert had asked years earlier that it go to whoever eventually proved themselves worthy of running what he'd actually built. I wear it now, most days, not as a trophy, just as a quiet reminder of who actually saw me first. If you've stayed with me this far into the story, I want to thank you honestly, because I know it's been a long one, and I know some of you are here because your own version of this story hasn't found its ending yet. Before I close this out, if this channel has given you even a few minutes of feeling understood tonight, please subscribe, it's free, and please share this with somebody who's still quietly absorbing what isn't theirs to carry. Because sometimes just knowing it's possible to reclaim your own name is enough to change how you show up tomorrow. Here's what I actually want you to take from all of this. More than the drama of the boardroom or the satisfaction of watching accountability finally land where it belonged. For years I believed that being useful and being valued were the same thing, and I let that belief cost me my own name in rooms I helped build with my own hands. It took losing everything publicly in front of strangers for me to remember that I had always carried more worth, and it turns out, more actual power, than anyone around me had ever bothered to acknowledge. I don't think the lesson here is about trust documents or corporate structures, honestly, even though that's the mechanism that happened to save me. I think the real lesson is smaller and applies to almost anybody watching this. If you have spent years quietly being the reason something works and somebody else keeps taking the bull for it, please stop assuming your patience will eventually be rewarded on its own. Sometimes it takes one clear, calm, deliberate action, one phone call, one email, one conversation you've been avoiding, to finally make the truth impossible to ignore. I don't hate Gary, and strangely, I don't even hate David, not anymore. What I feel now is closer to a quiet kind of peace, the peace that comes from knowing I never once had to raise my voice, never once had to beg anyone to see me clearly. I just had to remember what had been quietly, legally, truthfully mine all along, and finally use it. So if you take anything from tonight, let it be this. Keep your own folder. Keep your own proof. Trust yourself even when nobody else in the room seems to be paying attention. Because sometimes the people who see you most clearly aren't in that room at all, and sometimes justice doesn't arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives exactly the way mine did. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't fight anyone in that room. I just made one single phone call and I let the truth do everything else on its own. Thank you for listening to my story. Please subscribe if it moved you even a little, and share it with someone who needs to hear that their patience isn't the same thing as their worth.